Hi, Adam. Welcome to Forbidden Conversations. It's great to have you on. Um, your book, you wrote a book that's coming out August 12th, and it's called That Book is Dangerous, which is a very catchy title, I would say. Right? If you see a book on the bookshelf and it says that book is dangerous, you're definitely picking it up. That you probably shouldn't, right? That's the whole point of the warning, but it's also people can't resist it. Would love to hear a little bit about your background and how
Yeah,
you've come to write the book and what is it all about?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks for having me, Catherine. It's a cool podcast. So basically, so I did my PhD in English at Cornell. My research focused on book censorship, and I started there in fall of 2020. And around that time, there had been a bunch of really high-profile book controversies. So book controversies in children's literature, in young adult literature, in literature written for adults, in memoir. And the controversy sort of unfolded in different ways. So, in some contexts, like books were quite literally canceled. Like, I know people use the term cancel culture as maybe more of a metaphor, but books being canceled before their publication dates. Sometimes a book's publication date would be canceled, and then the book would be sent to sensitivity readers, like people hired to sort of edit the book for potentially offensive material, and then it would be like issued at a later date. There's books that were pulled from Amazon, from eBay. And while the controversies were different, and there were books in different genres, different age groups, the big consistency that they had was that these were all books basically being criticized in the name of progressive values. So it would be this book is racist or sexist or transphobic or homophobic. And like we could talk more about specific books if you're interested in that. Some of them I think some of these criticisms are more legit than others. Some of them I actually find personally preposterous. But the common theme was this was progressives attacking books written by other progressives in the name of progressive values. So that was super interesting to me. And basically, I was seeing this stuff. It reached the point where it was getting picked up and covered in places like the New York Times and the Post and Slate and the Journal. And basically, I was like, if this is what I know about as someone who does not work in publishing, then surely there has to be more to this going on behind closed doors. Like, surely these controversies have to be affecting acquisition practices and editing policies. So basically, I spent a few years just interviewing people really in every corner of literary culture. So quite literally, people, presidents and vice presidents at the big five publishers, so places like Penguin, Harper, Simon and Schuster, interviewing editors, interviewing agents at some of like really the biggest agencies, interviewing award-winning authors, even interviewing sensitivity readers, like the people who have been brought in to criticize these books. And basically, my book is about how this movement, which I think comes for the most part from a good place, like a place of wanting to make books less racist, less sexist, etc. It has really inaugurated a sort of whole new zeitgeist of self-censorship happening off the record that most people, if you're not in publishing, you're not going to know about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, even my own book, No Apologies, was I talked a bit about some of the self censorship elements around that. Didn't go that deeply into publishing, but definitely went a little bit into other forms of expression and artistic expression, and how important it is for, uh, artists to create. And sometimes there's going to be offensive content, but that offensive content has its own value. Um, but I'm kind of curious, like, because your book is published by Penguin, which is a pretty major publisher, and like you mentioned, you spoke to the big five and even sensitivity readers. When you started talking to them about this, like, what was that reaction? I'm almost surprised that this very dangerous book is got greenlit.
Yeah, so technically it's published by MIT Press and distributed by Penguin, but yeah, there's people from Penguin Random House who are involved in sort of like the sales distribution side. For the record, there was a number of people who are not interested in this book. I have a great agent right now, but he was not the only agent I reached out to. And like some agents specifically told me, they were like, I just don't foresee myself ever being able to sell this book, especially because I'm like, I sort of critique every major publisher in the book, and even a lot of like
Mhm.
review outlets like Kirkus Reviews, other places where agents, other people, like if they're not working at those places, they're like really close with people there. So yeah, it was not like an immediate sort of I wrote this book and then everyone's jumping to publish it. There's people who are very much not interested, but yeah, to your kind of question, the overwhelming majority of people that I reached out to like never got back to me. And there's practical reasons for that. Like I was just a random guy reaching out to people like through cold emails at Simon and Schuster, Penguin Random House, major literary agencies. I'm not paying people for their time when I interview them. But a bigger part of this was like people are understandably really uncomfortable talking about this stuff, especially if they themselves have a critical attitude towards it. So, I'll just be honest with you. The question that I was asked the most as the person interviewing people, and just to give you some context, so like I did this research while I was at Cornell, so like I did like whole other levels of approval because it's human participant research. So we have what's called an IRB, so like I have to write a consent form, I have to verify that people have read it. On my recordings, they're verifying that they read it. So like even after they go through this whole process, even when I tell them like they're going to be de-identified in the book, like I'm going to remove their name, data is going to be stored in like a very safe way. The most frequent question that I was asked in these interviews is just people like double checking or triple checking that I'm not going to actually use their real name. So just stuff like, hey, I just want to like make sure that the criticism I just offered of sensitivity readers or what have you, like I'm not going to be linked to that anyway. And for me, like, I'm not fucking reporting on like the NSA or something. Like I'm not doing some deep investigative dive of like the Trump administration. I'm just writing a book about sort of hypersensitivity in the world of publishing. But like to like hear the fear in people's voices, even people who you would be like, this person has so much power that they should be able to say whatever they want. Like these people being like, hey, I just, or like sending me a follow-up email. Hey, I just want to like triple check, make sure I'm not being attached to that. And it's like, like my dad was in the military. I grew up around people who are in the military. Like I've been around people who have seen like actual shit in their lives and stuff. And then to like be on the phone with like an editor and they're talking to me like I'm about to blow the lid off like the
Hmm.
biggest, case in like US history or something. It was wild to me to be in that context.
Were the so for say like the big five, are there all people at those companies, are they all anonymous then in the book?
Yeah, in the book, I de-identify them. So like one thing I do is I'll identify people by like their position. So like an editor at a big five, so that like nothing can get back to them, but so that it also like gives the reader a sense of like, what sort of role these people are actually playing in publishing. But I suspect if I tried to get everyone to speak on the record, I would have like 3 interview subjects maybe.
When you tried to get the book picked up,
Yeah.
what kind of rejections were they sort of just very vague, or did people directly say things to you about why they
Yeah.
felt like they couldn't publish it?
Yeah, it was a combination. I would say vague was the most frequent, and in many cases, an acquisitions editor. So, like, I don't know how familiar listeners are would be with sort of like the inside baseball of publishing, but basically, if you're trying to get a book published, like you want to get an acquisitions editor excited about it, and then like their job is to then communicate their excitement to other decision makers, and then if enough people are on board, they come back to you with an offer. So in many cases, I had an acquisitions editor who was like super excited, super like, this is going to be an awesome book. I think it's going to do well commercially. And then, they circle back with me in a week and they're like, hey, like just a vague rejection, like, oh, this is, after talking with people, like, this is not the right case for us. But I will say there was one publisher, a very, big, prestigious publisher, an acquisitions editor was very, very excited about this. And this was I wrote the book as like what we call a crossover book. So like I wanted it to be published by a university press in case I wanted to stay in academia, but I also wrote it as a trade book. So it's like a book that's meant to sell well, but also a book that has like a rigorous enough research component to pass peer review and stuff like that. So like I took it to another, what I would consider like a top 3, top 5 university press, and acquisitions editor was very on board with it, loved it. She sent it through peer review. And I'm not saying this to like exaggerate or anything. Like she verbatim told me that in her history of working for the press, she had never had peer review reports that were that good. They were just like glowing, like, you need to pick this book up ASAP, try to publish it ASAP. It's super timely, super awesome. No one's writing about this in the way he's writing about it. So she was like, this is going to be awesome. Took it to our team, and she got back to me and she was like, hey, I'm just going to be honest with you. Like we can't get this green light. They're really worried about the backlash that they're going to face for publishing this, because not only do you critique major institutions, many of which like we have relationships with, you also like mention lots of people by name in this book, many people who have really large Twitter followings. And like, one thing that the people who criticize these books hate is like being criticized themselves. So they were really concerned about that. And, I was kind of like, is it all right to swear on this podcast? I do
Yeah,
that.
you can. Yeah,
Okay,
free
right.
speech.
I'm from Boston, like flippant with the F word. So I'm basically like, that's fucking not how peer review is supposed to work. Like, are you shitting me? So I kind of put up a little fuss. One of my peer reviewers found out, and they were like, why did I just spend time like evaluating 100,000 word manuscript and writing you a peer review report for you to just like toss it out the window? Like, that is absolutely not how scholarly publishing is supposed to work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's especially scholarly publishing in particular, including this university, which has this press, which has like been outspoken on free speech and blah, 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 blah. They're supposed to be the ones who are like, we'll publish this if a trade publisher won't, because we're committed to truth seeking and knowledge. And so it just like really pissed me off. So anyways, there was this whole internal brouhaha, and it ended up going up to like the president of the publisher. And like all these people were involved. I'm just sort of like waiting to hear back. And basically the acquisitions editor calls me and she's like, hey, like, I'm not going to bullshit you. Like I'm not going to waste time with that. Like, here's the situation. They were basically like, and this is the president. She was like, they basically said, like, if you want to do another book first and you publish that as your first book, like a more, like a less controversial book, and it does well, and then you want to come back to us with this book when you already have a big platform, then that's like enough incentive for us to like withstand the potential backlash. Basically, she was like, if you can just like become the next John McWhorter or like Steven Pinker, then we'll stand behind you. But right now you're just like a first time author. So like, nah, I can't get them to do that. And for the record, like the editor she was fucking awesome. I have nothing bad to say about her. She actually was part of like she talked to MIT and stuff and was basically like, my publisher can't publish this awesome book, but like you guys, I think, have a different relationship with like intellectual freedom and stuff. And MIT has been nothing but awesome. But yeah, I was like, that's fucking ridiculous. But it was also like, there's a sort of like dark comic sensibility to it, in the sense that my whole book is fucking about that. And then for them to basically be like, we're not going to like take on this book for the same reasons that you talk about. I was just like,
Yeah, it's
okay.
definitely very ironic, but not surprising.
Yeah.
I am kind of curious, like, because I think in some ways, some people might say, well, this has been talked about forever now for so many years. Like, who cares anymore? This is, what kind of keeps that book relevant to
Yeah.
today as it was maybe 5 years ago, where I think
Sure.
we were at the height of some of this stuff?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I want to talk about. So first off, I think like for lack of a better word, like cancel culture stuff has been written about extensively to such a degree. Like even as someone interested in that, like if a new book comes out on it, I would say it's pretty unlikely I'm going to like learn anything new or it's going to be like compelling to me. I think there's some exceptions to that. Like Musa Al-Gharbi wrote a really amazing book that came out last year that, you know, immediately was like one of the best books on the topic that I read. Like, you know, but I would say for me, I'm unfamiliar with a book about publishing like mine. Like my book is not about like cancel culture broadly conceived. It's very focused on the production of books. And I'm unfamiliar with another book about that. Two, you know, one of the arguments I make is that the sort of liberal cultural stuff, whether you call it wokeness or cancel culture, I think it has like a very direct relationship with right-wing political power. And by that, I mean when the right ascends electorally, the left culture war shit like picks up astronomically. So I don't think it's a coincidence that like around 2016, when Donald Trump was first elected to office, you have like all these sort of book controversies. You have all this stuff on campus that's like about fighting racism and xenophobia and whatever. I think like the seeds of political defeat are like really fertile seeds for wokeness, cancel culture, all that stuff. So like, you know, now that Trump is in office again, like I would not be surprised if some of this stuff has picked up. And like, you know, just off the top of my head, a few months ago, the New York Times did an article on a novel that I forget the name of it. But it came under fire for like ostensibly being like too conservative or something. But like one of the critiques at the center of this controversy was that it includes a fictional character who was quote unquote too sympathetic to Elon Musk. And I believe it was a romance novel, and I believe it was canceled. I would have to double check that, but you know, it was like a brouhaha big enough for the Times to cover it. So like I'm reading that and I wasn't like terribly surprised because again, like, you know, when the right controls the Oval Office, Supreme Court, the majority of state legislatures, you have people like highly educated liberals who are upset about this, understandably. And I think they're kind of like, well, fuck, I can't change the Supreme Court. I can't change the Oval Office, the Senate, the House, at least, you know, not for a couple of years, but I can fight racism in my department at Oberlin College, or I can fight sexism in this book.
So it's
Or
this counter, I guess this counterbalance is what you would suggest. It's this it's a powerlessness that's reflected in the places where there is control, room for control, essentially,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
I think that, I mean, I think that's a great point. Again, I think it comes from a need to like do something to give it like the most generous reading possible. I think there's actually other incentives at work in a lot of this stuff, not the least of which is like just jealousy.
Mm.
But I think that's part of it. And then to your point, like these are spaces, yeah, where people can actually like get something done, quote unquote. Like publishing, even though some of the you know, like the big five have their very, very, very small handful of conservative imprints, publishing overall is heavily dominated by liberals in terms of who actually makes up that workforce. They only publish conservative books because they generate a fuckload of money. Like when you publish Mike Pence's memoir, like that's going to be a hit, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, for the most part, publishing is overwhelmingly left of center. So like that's like a winnable sort of field, I guess.
Well, you can look at publishing as okay from a financial perspective, right? And be like, okay, we're going to publish Mike Pence's novel, but also conservative writers because financially there's a market there. But
100%.
it does seem to me like there is more of a fear in general that people might pass on the lucrative side of it and not publish some of these books and not look at it as just financially based
100%.
decisions. What is it? Is it like, is there, do you think there's like an additional layer of fear that arises? And if so, why?
Fear on the part of people who want to see these books published or people who are opposed to
And
that.
people who are making those decisions, the publishers, because they're afraid of the
Yeah.
backlash.
Yeah, for sure. So, like you mentioned Pence, I mentioned Pence. You know, I think a great example is Canadian example. So when Jordan Peterson's book 12 Rules for Life was scheduled to be published by Penguin Random House Canada. Now, granted, 12 Rules for Life isn't even a political book. It's mostly like a sort of self-help book
Mhm.
where he's got a chapter called like Clean Your Room, stuff like that. But because Peterson had been so widely criticized for his views on trans people, et cetera, like that was a huge brouhaha at Penguin Random House Canada, to the point where they had a town hall and like people were literally crying. Like I talked to someone who was at that meeting and she was like, like literal tears were coming out of people's mind. And those people were willing to sacrifice gargantuan profits because they believed it was like truly wrong to be publishing this horrible person, Jordan Peterson. Now, to your question about like the fear, the person I interviewed who was in the room for that, she was like, I was afraid of speaking out and defending Peterson because like I don't want to get called like a TERF or a racist or something. And granted, this person was a woman of color who identifies as a feminist, who is otherwise, in her own words, like very committed to like making literature better in the sense of like not using recycled stereotypes, having more diverse people in publishing. So like this is not, I wasn't talking to some like, fucking
Right winger
or something, it was like she's like I'm a woman of color, I'm a feminist, ostensibly all this shit is supposed to be like about like protecting me or something. And she was just like, dude, I was not about to like like come out and just start defending Jordan Peterson, because then again I would be called a TERF or a racist or a conservative, which is now just like an epithet in certain circles. So yeah, that was, again, as someone who like, I think is more prone to like speak my mind and stuff like that, to like hear that, I'm just like, damn, like that's super.
Why are you more prone to speak your mind, do you think?
I mean, I could like post talk try to psychoanalyze myself. I don't know how accurate that would be, but I don't know. I've just kind of always been like that since I was younger.
Yeah.
I mean, in this case, like I'm not like a robot. Like I do, like even when my advisors at Cornell are like, if you write this book, like you're totally burning yourself on like the academic job market in certain departments and things like that. But at the end of the day, I was like, if I want to be told what I can write and what I can say and stuff, like there's way more lucrative jobs than like being a writer or something. Like I could just go fucking do that. But if I'm gonna like try to write books, kind of do my thing, then I'm gonna sort of write and say whatever I want. And frankly, I think also like, when I wrote this book, like if you were outside my office, you would hear me laughing because some of the stuff I find so insane that is actually comical. But other times I'm just like talking to myself and I'm just like, are you fucking serious? Like how could anyone think like that is racist or like that is white supremacist? And I guess when I get annoyed and angry, I'm not just gonna like, I don't know, like sit there and like keep it bottled up or something. I'm gonna be like, okay, well, fuck it, I'm gonna write about this.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a world where I think people very much struggle with speaking their mind, even if they have views. I think almost like in whispers, like I've been talking about this stuff for a long time now. Well, not that long in the scale of things, but a number of years. And when I first started speaking about these kinds of topics, it was definitely terrifying, but B, it was something that other people felt like they couldn't do. So I was like, felt like I was taking on the risk. And today I think we're in a little bit of a different place where I think some people have been sort of emboldened as well, where it's no longer just about, oh, okay, let's protect the sanctity of, free speech and exchange of ideas so we can actually openly discuss difficult topics. But it has become something a little bit more sinister in my view, the way I'm seeing it. And it is where you kind of realize, well, you know what? Some people really were fighting for the freedom to say the N-word and all that stuff, right? Like all the stuff that you thought, like I thought, maybe naively, that that's not what people want to do. But actually turns out there is a subset, and that's a large enough subset of people that's exactly what they wanted to do. So it's like that balance of things, like you want you want the freedom for people to speak so they can exchange ideas and, occasionally say the wrong thing and not necessarily face like, a life sentence for it.
Sure.
At the same time, you don't necessarily want this other extremist um, thing but to happen, but at the same time, it's like you can't if you have one, you have both, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know like the term virtue signaling was thrown a lot around a lot. And, I think that's a useful term in some contexts, but like the opposite of virtue is vice. And um, I think Thomas Chatterton Williams wrote an essay about this or something, but he used the term vice signaling. And there's definitely people engaged in that, especially on like social media and stuff like that, sort of just like saying and doing like actual like racist things, either because they actually are racist or it's just fun to like really get a rise out
Punch.
of people and like provoke people. And like obviously with the political shifts, depending on what sort of context you're in, like you can do those things and get away with it without the same consequences that like say an undergraduate student at Yale is going to face for doing the same thing.
And it's like, okay, how do you navigate, right? Like if there is a book that's, a modern version of Mein Kampf, and that gets to a publisher's desk
Yeah.
versus, a book that maybe just pushes boundaries a little bit and
Yeah.
is discussing a complex issue, like there has to be a level of discernment that does happen, right? You don't want to just put out everything just because it's going to sell.
Sure.
Um, but how do you suggest we navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just make one thing clear: like nothing even approximating some kind of Mein Kampf is going to be like published by like Simon and Schuster, Penguin Random House.
Yeah.
If you can even get like a book by Ted Cruz through like the one conservative imprint on there, like that's already a historic landslide, and it's only going to get published because they know Ted's going to sell a fuckload of copies. I think as far as like there's obviously books, including well-intentioned books that do recreate racist stereotypes, that do like portray certain groups in a negative light. And like these are problems that go back not just decades, but like centuries. Like W.E.B. Du Bois was writing about the underrepresentation of like African American children in literature and like a lack of like positive like role models in lit for people who aren't white and stuff like that. So like those things are all real. And like I know for me, like I would never offer like some sort of general rule or something about like what crosses the proverbial line, so to speak. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff needs to be talked about and debated at the concrete level of like an actual book. But like one thing I will say is that like the books that I write about in my book, like those are not like some fringe right-wing books that like somehow slip through the sensitivity readers and are now like doing serious harm in the world or something. Virtually every single book I write about is a book written by a progressive that has been criticized by other progressives for not being progressive enough. And a lot of those times, like the criticism is so esoteric and like out of touch with like mainstream definitions of whatever, pick your phobia or ism, racism, homophobia, whatever, that like normal people are just kind of like, what, like this doesn't even fucking make sense. Like some of the books, like, and this is why I'm generally, like even books that are quote unquote like controversial, I think without even knowing the case, I tend to stand by like not pulling them from publication or anything like that. Because even books I talk about in my book that people are just like, oh, this is so racist, so self-evident stuff. Like when you go to like say Amazon and you look at like the reviews of those books, like you'll see people who are like, I'm an African American mom and like I actually really enjoy this book. Like I'm not saying it's perfect, like there's problems with it we can talk about, we can talk to our kid about, but like I actually think it's a good book. Or like even if I don't think it's a good book, I actually think it's a great resource for having conversations. But like when you're actually trying to like pressure publishers to like quite literally like remove books from bookstores and actually like burn these copies so
Mhm.
that people can't get access to them because apparently they're that dangerous. um I think that that has all sorts of problems with it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a particular case. I think it was Elizabeth Gilbert was the author, where her book was set in Russia, like old Russia,
Okay.
and basically on Goodreads, they just put out like all these. I mean, the book wasn't out, and all the reviews were 0 stars or 1 star, I guess. And and there was this whole like campaign. I think I don't remember if that's the right author, so forgive me if it's not.
Sure.
But that book, I just remember even like I kind of spoke out about it, and I'm like from Ukraine. It's just that I don't think like setting a book in a very old rural Russia of
Yeah.
the past is really like this faux pas. And but people did think that, and when I stepped into it, like I got attacked like so badly, and I'm like actively pro Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so you kind of
You
but
gotta
like
flex your
she ended up
Ukrainian identity.
yeah, well, and she ended up being she canceled that book, right? She
Yeah.
herself kind of was like, yeah, she kind of went the mob was right, and um I'm
Did she
gonna put it
promise
away at
to
least
do
for now.
better? Did she promise to do better in her
I mean,
that's favorite?
probably. It's the Eat, Pray, Love
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
writer.
I'm
Is that
familiar
is
with her work, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's her name, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, it's just and I remember thinking that is such an appeasement. She wasn't writing about contemporary Russia, and it's just
Wild.
when things like that, like you control the creative to that extent, the mob controls the creative to that extent. It's like it's a really hit for on art. Were there like particularly preposterous cancellations that you can recall?
Yeah, there's so many. One thing I'll note, because you brought up Goodreads,
Mhm.
Goodreads is a decrepit cesspool, in my opinion. That said, they're actually running.
Please tell me how you really feel.
I'll also
Just
say
a
that
review.
they're also
That
running a giveaway with my book right now. So, like, if you are on Goodreads, you can potentially get a free copy.
okay.
I don't know if they're gonna pull that now. My
Yes.
publicist is probably like, "Why did you just say that?" No, so Goodreads. A lot of these like book scandals start on Goodreads, and the thing. So like the biggest thing I find problematic about Goodreads is, um, in my book, I talk about the absolute deluge of people who review books they haven't read. And this is not a source of shame for these people. So like
Mhm.
by contrast, like, I've taught English at Cornell for a number of years. If some kid came in my class and just started totally trashing a book and prefaced his attack by just being like, yeah, I haven't even opened this book, but I'm just gonna fucking rant about this for 5 minutes. It's so self-evidently preposterous. It's absolutely preposterous that I would never see that. But behind the sort of anonymous reviewing of Goodreads, or even people use their own names, like they will
Mhm.
say shit like, my friend on Twitter like posted a screenshot of an advanced reading copy of this passage that's racist. Therefore, I'm giving this 0 stars, and I encourage other people to do the same. So, like, you'll see shit where it's like, yo, this book isn't even coming out for a month. And I know, as someone familiar with publishing, that fucking 1,000 people or however many people have not had access to this book. And yet, you've like totally destroyed this fucking book's rating. Like they call it the Goodreads review bomb, and people like ask other people to engage in
Mhm.
this. They'll be like, "We need to bomb this fucking book," and
I
like,
think that happens a lot on there, but even Amazon, like even I've had a review, a couple of reviews on Amazon where people clearly didn't read it, and it was one of them in particular was kind of a joke review about how I'm holding people hostage, and it's like it was just such obvious nonsense, and yet you can't get that review removed. And on Goodreads as well, there are a couple where it's like clearly that they did not read the book, and it's like why is that allowed? And it has such a
100%.
bearing on an author, right? Like,
Yeah.
especially somebody who's maybe not super, if you're getting thousands and thousands of reviews, unless they're, like you said, bombing intentionally, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, a few reviews aren't gonna make such a substantial difference. But if you're somebody who is like still kind of early on, those reviews make a big difference, and they're false a lot of times.
Yeah. No, it's really, I mean, I would say like the emotions that I felt writing this book and like immersing myself in this bizarro world for years. My main emotions were just annoyance, frustration, anger on the one hand, and then like laughing my ass off because I still find some of this stuff like so bizarre that it actually makes me laugh. But like with those people, I actually feel bad. I do like genuinely feel bad, especially when it's like a debut author. Cause like this is the thing that is so messed up about this is like most of the people like the overwhelming majority of people reviewing books on Amazon, Goodreads, these other like vanity platforms where people can just self-publish, like they're not writers. Like they don't fucking write books. Like they did not work for a book on 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 7 years. They did not spend 2 years trying to find an agent. They did not go through 50, 60 rejections for their agent, 20, 30
Mm.
rejections for the publisher. It's a fucking really hard process. Like I know personally, even if a book is fucking trash, especially if it's fiction, I would not go out of my way to like leave it a bad review. In the same way I don't give bad reviews of restaurants. Like someone would literally have to like throw a pie in my face for me to do that because I know it's so fucking hard to like get that off the ground and like, to use the Latin phrase,
Mm.
de gustibus deus disputandum, like matters of taste, there can be no disagreement. So like even if I don't like this restaurant, even if I don't like this book, like I know how hard that is because I've been on
Mm.
the other side. I'm not just gonna trash it, but like you go on Goodreads and you'll see like some fucking nobody who has like 175 fucking reviews on Goodreads who doesn't actually produce art themselves, just like trashing people.
Mm.
And I'm just like, that's like wild. And like there's real consequences of that. If you're a debut author, your book gets trashed, especially wrongfully. And like the biggest sort of predictor of like whether you're going to be able to sell your second book, your third book, actually have a career is like how good does your first book do? Not just in terms of sales, but in terms of reviews and things like that. So like, yeah, it's like it's really unfortunate to see that, especially in a community like the sort of woke Goodreads community, like very much
Mm.
touts itself as like these really like do-gooders, these empathetic people, these like gatekeepers, these people who quote unquote care about like the literary community. But like, I mean, these people are absolutely vicious towards one another.
I wonder, do you think the left is more prone to cancellations, or is it that they just have more cultural power so they can do it?
Yeah, so I think there's different types of quote unquote cancellations. So I don't think there's any debate whatsoever that the political right is far, far, far more effective at getting books removed, censored through legislative means. Like if you go to PEN America's website, you go to American Library Association's website, and you look at maps of like book challenges by legislatures, that is almost entirely right-wing censorship. And that is censorship not just of like books with like clear progressive messages. That's just like books that like have a gay character in that. So like they're astronomically effective at that. And they have a very well-oiled machine. There's fucking all sorts of funding, et cetera, et cetera. Talk about that all day. But in terms of publishing, yeah, it's overwhelmingly like the sort of social media cancellations and those sorts of things. It's overwhelmingly either like politically neutral authors or progressive authors because like that's their ecosystem. Like
Why
again,
do you think that happens more? Like, why do you think the right tends to go through the legal system more and the left tends to do it more socially?
yeah. So I asked that question of a president. It was either a president or a vice president at a big five. And basically, I asked him, I was like, hey, man, like, what do you do? Because like he has dealt with liberal people, like going after his publisher and saying like we need to cancel this book, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, what do you do when it's conservatives who target a book? And he was basically like, they don't really like do that. Like they focus on legislation. But he's like, even in that case, if that were to happen, um, he was basically, he didn't use these exact words, but he was basically like, we don't really give a shit. Like he's like, cool. So like a bunch of conservatives in Southern Florida are upset about this book that has a gay person. I talked to other people who actually wear that as like a badge of pride. In the sense like, oh, we published this book and Moms for Liberty, which is a right wing advocacy
Mm.
group, oh, they're upset about it. Like that means we're like doing good work. And the difference is like when you have a publishing house that is like almost entirely liberals, and even people like on are sort of like the furthest edges of the left. Yeah, they're not
So it's
incentivized.
just a matter of how effective the tools are. So for conservatives, it seems like legislation is effective
Yeah,
because boycotts are essentially not, at least not maybe in publishing. And then because we are seeing conservatives sort of turn to some of these kinds of tools like the boycotts, the
sure,
cancellations, but in other areas, like maybe with stores, for example, in retail, we've seen that. But with books, because the culture is tends to be so much more left leaning, or in the entertainment industry,
sure,
it's just very effective. Because I guess also people are more afraid of their peers disagreeing with them, of them being wrong potentially. And then also like the social consequences can be that you might never publish again in the industry if you say the wrong thing,
yeah,
or publish the wrong book, or maybe you're yeah, it's like work opportunities is also a consequence. So they don't need to necessarily go the legal route because
sure,
they sort of control the publishing mechanism. Is
yeah.
that kind of an accurate?
Yeah, to give you like a hypothetical counterexample. So like if you look at right wing outlets like National Review, City Journal, um, if the typical like left of center person reads those articles, like they'll probably fucking hate them and stuff like that. But you could organize like thousands of progressives to like what tweet at National Review to like try to retract an article. Like they're not going to give a shit. Like they're
Mm.
so clearly conservative that they're just like, I like, we don't care. In the same way, like talk to people in publishing who are literally like, if a book I worked on is the subject of a book ban, like that
Like a
setting to me, but it
badge.
actually makes me feel like prideful. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, like sort of fuck those conservatives. Like, if they're upset about this, then like this means I'm doing, God's work. Well, they don't say God's work, like, good work.
Yeah. If God doesn't exist. No. Okay. um, yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think on the topic of conservative sort of cancellations, because the legal mechanism is also a very kind of dangerous
Mhm.
place to be. And I have seen cancellations of like, so you mentioned like books that might have a gay character, but even like science fiction books that don't really have anything all that controversial, just because maybe it's a different perspective on maybe God or
Yeah,
lack of, or kind of goes against some kind of doctrine. And I've seen these cancellations because I think when I talk to conservatives, they always like to bring up that, oh, it's like books that are, it's basically porn in these that's on bookshelves at schools.
sure.
And there is some truth to that, in the sense that there are some books that are probably not age appropriate for the for the children, or young people who have access to it. So I can see that. But I don't think there's much conversation about these other books that are also being targeted, that really don't have any content that's so age inappropriate.
Yeah,
And certainly, by high school, there's most things you can kind of read, and that's okay.
sure.
So I think that's often missing from that conversation. But both
Yeah,
tools
no, I
of
agree.
censorship, right? Like both tools of, whether you're using the legal system or you're using the cultural system, the end result is the same. So it's just that, as you sort of pointed out, I think it's just each group is using whatever is most effective for them.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and there's enormous hypocrisy on both sides of like you can find actual leaders on both the left and the right who, like, people on the left will be like, oh, fuck Ron DeSantis, Ted Cruz, like, these are censors, this is Orwellian, this Fahrenheit 451. And then it's like, dude, I just went through your Twitter feed and you like totally tweeted at like HarperCollins to cancel a fucking book. So like, what are you talking about? And then obviously they would be like, oh, like, just because I'm for free speech doesn't mean like I'm saying
It's
you can
hate
publish
speech.
anything and and it's just like, dude, there's and on the right, like, I mean, that shit is so self-evident that I don't even have to go into like the sheer number of right-wing people who have like built entire platforms criticizing wokeness, cancel culture, who are like, you know, leading these legislative you know, charges either on the grassroots level or the electoral level. But there's relatively few people, you know, like I would consider myself sort of in like the free speech sort of like anti-censorship, like intellectual journalistic spheres. So like I know a lot of people, but I would say there's relatively few people who are actually like free speech down the line for people they agree with, like, or disagree with rather. That's not a lot of people.
No, and I think it's I think once you're faced with certain kind of speech, it sometimes challenges your perspective on it. And I think like for me, I'm quite firmly like the government should play no role in limiting speech. However, when we start talking about, okay, like let's take a publisher and what should they or shouldn't they publish. Now, I'm not going to write to a publisher and say, hey, I really don't think you should have published that book. But do I think like I used the word discernment earlier? It's just the reality is no publisher is going to publish every single book that's out
Sure.
there, right? And that's impossible. So they're choosing books based on what they can sell, but also their own personal tastes and their beliefs, and that's always going to color that. And it's the same thing with platforms. Like, oh, you should, if people criticize somebody for platforming, and people hate that word, platforming someone, um, well, again, the reality is that they're making a choice and we
Sure.
can criticize that choice. Now, I'm not going to say because you've made that choice, you should be taken off the air. You are entitled to make that choice, but I'm entitled to also criticize that you've made that
Sure.
choice and maybe not watch if I think that you continuously make these choices that I disagree with.
Yeah.
Because to me, it shows, well, you don't have discernment. I don't think that's censorship, but a lot of people would say that it is a form of censorship. So I think there's this like strange contradiction in this. And it's just we don't have this perfect way of operating. We don't. There is no absolute side. I think you do have to sort of go case by case basis. That might be the only way to kind of deal with that, because it's like, okay, if somebody, I don't want to like, give an example of the extreme, but, say you did publish a book that promotes some kind of extremism.
Yeah.
Um, well, okay, but like I wonder, okay, why did you do it? Is there a purpose to it? Is it to showcase like, and it's the same thing with platforming people. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, you can have anybody on your show and your podcast and interview anybody you want. But is there a purpose to it? Are you promoting something that, maybe isn't so great for the world, that, according to me, right? Or are it's because it's always going to be biased. Um, or are you like showing something that maybe the world needs to see, or holding a mirror, or trying to explain or find out more information, or maybe we got it wrong, and by, allowing this person on your show, they get to explain what they really are about. So I think, and I use the words responsible platforming like I would responsible publishing, and it gets people really, really angry, I find. Um, but ultimately, if you're nothing is ever a free for all. It's just
Mhm.
not. Like I said, you're not going to publish every book. So there has to be some sort of reasoning behind it. And we, the audience or the readers, we can kind of decide for ourselves, hey, do we think that that's like a plausible, decent kind of reasoning for publishing a book?
Yeah.
And, I have always just kind of preached for more tolerance, but it doesn't mean it's like an absolute, oh, anything goes either.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's a very eloquent way of saying it. Especially when you're, I know we're talking about books, but especially when you're talking about podcasts that have like enormous platforms. Um, for me, it's not just a question of sort of intent. Like, let's say I have a podcast that has 5 million listeners, and I want to have on Alex Jones because I think he's fucking crazy, and I just want to like understand his psychology, and that's interesting to me to like have that type of interview. But at the same time, like regardless of my intent, like there's going to be effects of that, especially if because of my podcast, Alex Jones or whoever comes off as really likable and knowledgeable. I know like I like Sam Harris, I like Joe Rogan. I listen to both their podcasts. I know Sam Harris, loves Joe Rogan a lot, but like one thing he's been very critical of is like, Rogan's platform is number one in the world now. It's not just like him in a basement like it was 10 years ago smoking weed with Brian Redband. So like when he has, and this is Sam Harris's critique, he's like when he has on people who, according to Sam Harris, are like putting forth anti-Semitic versions of history and other stuff. And like, according to Sam Harris, like Rogan doesn't really have like the sort of training to like correct misinformation and stuff like that. Like that has effects because now there's millions of people sort of coming away with that. And like on the flip side, I understand someone like Rogan who's like, this isn't like a partisan podcast. I really am just trying to understand how people arrived at their beliefs and conclusions. But I think like again, I'm not saying like censor Rogan or Rogan's right, Sam Harris is wrong, but I think it's like a worthwhile conversation to have, particularly in the case of like enormous platforms, whether that's podcasts or whether that's who's getting a 7-figure deal from Simon and Schuster. Like I know part of the uproar around like Jordan Peterson, around Mike Pence's memoir, was not just that they were getting book deals. It was not just that they were getting access to like the best sales and marketing in the world of literature, but it's also like these are people who are getting like really like amazing advances and stuff like that. And like those are advances that are not going to, any number of other people because of that.
I would
And
say
that's
this.
leadership to critique that.
Yeah, I would say this with great power. I'm going to quote Spider-Man's uncle, I guess. With great power comes great responsibility, right? So somebody like Joe Rogan, he doesn't have to do anything. Whatever he wants to do, he can do. But I do believe that if you're putting out things out there, you should be cautious. You should be informed, especially if you're talking about particular topics. You should challenge your guests. And by the way, we all can fail. I've failed. I've had some cases where I missed something or didn't remember something, didn't push back, or was myself kind of fell for somebody's narrative because of what
Sure.
I was going through in my life. And then I try as much as I can when that happens to self correct. So take away and learn for next time. But also like in one case I'd done a follow-up podcast specifically discussing why I missed certain things. And I think that I can't force anybody to do those things, but sure would be nice to see somebody like Rogan, or Rogan has a lot of resources, so he could have live fact checking, for example.
I love how the checking. And again,
Yes, Jamie.
yeah, I was about to say it's just like Jamie pull that up, and it's just like
Yeah.
fair
I
enough.
mean, that's cool. I kind of like that. I've seen some podcasts where I think trigonometry does this, where or maybe I'm not sure actually, but I've seen some podcaster to do this in the edit where they'll fact check certain things, and
Oh, interesting.
I think that's a smart way to do it. Pe- People also think that fact checking is a dirty word, but there are like facts, which are there's opinion and there is like things that we can actually quantify and check. So if somebody says, on such and such date, this particular thing happened, and we have historical evidence for that, or archaeological evidence for that, we can have a very high degree of certainty that something is true.
Yeah.
Um, it's just that fact checking has kind of gone into things that are a little bit more objective. That's why it kind of has that bad reputation. But in reality, there is an objective truth to some things that we can quantify. And I think in those cases, if we can do that, I think that's a good thing. That's why I do support things like community notes on X. Again, not a perfect system though, for sure, not at all. But or if AI is used to sort of, you know, I've noticed people tagging like Grok lately and
Yeah, yeah.
asking them to verify. Again, these systems, they hallucinate, they're not perfect
Yeah,
and
isn't
shouldn't be
Grok like,
taken as
did
gospel.
Grok say some like
Well,
Nazi shit like 3 days ago
oh
or something?
yes. He went it went quite Nazi. Metric started calling himself Metric Hitler because they removed the Gartleys. I mean, that's why I say these systems are very far from being perfect and they can be manipulated, and also the AI hallucinates. But it is a start. At least it is something that allows some level of actually fact checking, because the spread of falsehoods is very, very high on social media. And once people hear a falsehood multiple times, the way that their brains work, over time, our resistance to these false things goes down because we recognize them as familiar. And therefore, the more something is repeated, the more likely we are to believe it. It's just how we are as human beings. And social media obviously kind of feeds off of that. And so we need to recognize these things. And I think we do need better tools for allowing people to figure out what is and wasn't right. And I don't believe in censorship, but I do believe in providing more context. I think
Hmm.
that's kind of the right way to go with that. So even, I mean, with art, it's kind of difficult, right? Because they started doing these contextual things in front of movies, and some people will disagree with that too. For example, if it's a movie from, a really long time ago, they might write, well, this part was racist or whatever. Um, I think it's okay to give a degree of context if you don't change the art itself, because you can then be like, this is bollocks, and ignore it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you get to still see the art and judge it for yourself. If somebody writes some, history of the artist, for example, and maybe they have some bad things in their past, okay, you can take that into consideration, but you don't have to draw a conclusion on it if you don't want to. So I'm
Yeah.
more into like, hey, let's give people more rather than less.
Hmm.
And I think that's a better form of kind of being able to maybe have a little bit of input on maybe things that are wrong, or things that through today's lens are viewed differently, and provide that context, but still let people see things for themselves.
For sure.
What were like the most preposterous? We I think we never like. Can you give me a couple of examples of the?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this one, I mean, the very first paragraph of my book, I start off with this example because this. So I'll tell you about it. I'm not even sure it's the most preposterous, but the way it unfolded is absolutely preposterous. So there was this YA author. Her name's Amelia Wenzel. She had a debut book that, from what I remember, it got a really good advance fantasy book, and basically, um, this book set in a fantastical world where there's slavery, but it's not based on skin color. And I think it was early 2019 this was supposed to come out. And again, as far as I can tell, Amelia Wenzel is just like a typical liberal. I've gone through her Twitter, and there's nothing conservative about her. She's a woman of color. It seems like she's actually really into like the whole like diverse books, multicultural stuff. But basically, like people started attacking this book, and like one of the criticisms was that this was like whitewashing slavery and like anti-black because it had slavery, but it wasn't based off skin color, and that itself was like some sort of like more elaborate form of like anti-blackness. That was one of the critiques. There were some other ones, but basically this debut author, who before this happened was probably stoked. I think she worked in like finance before, so like
Hmm.
Yeah, I think she got a great advance and was probably, ready to get the fuck out of that soul deadening area of corporate life. But all this criticism happened, and the book ended up being canceled before publication, and it was sent to sensitivity readers to sort of like edit the manuscript, and then it came out. I think I want to say like maybe 6 months after um, it's supposed to be published. Again, I talk about this in the book, and my memory is not as maybe sharp as some other people's with the details. So read the book. But anyway, so it gets canceled. Sensitivity readers comes out again. Very interesting because I've looked at both. I've looked at like the book itself, and like it doesn't acknowledge that like changes were made to the original thing. And this is something that actually happens with a lot of other books, especially classics that get like rewritten over time to like keep up with contemporary standards. I think that's problematic, kind of what you were talking about context. But essentially, her book gets canceled. It eventually comes out after being sensitivity readers. But like the best part of this story is one of the people who like led the charge against her on social media is this guy Kosako Jackson, who is a sensitivity reader for Big Five publishers. So like literally his job is to just be a hypersensitive person. So he critiques her book either for those reasons or some other ones. I don't recall there being a single reasonable accusation against this person. So he critiques her. She ends up getting canceled. But like 3 months later, like the same community goes after this guy. And his debut book was about to come out, and it got canceled for like being Islamophobic or something like that. And
Oh, wow.
his book was actually never published. I was able to get an advanced reading copy through a connection. So like I have it. It's not fucking Mein Kampf. It's just honestly like I think most people would regard it as sort of like a progressive book. He's an author of color. I think he's a gay dude too. He's like very in that hypersensitivity space. But it was just so absurd to see this like internecine sort of like hyper liberal people going after other hyper liberal people for not, I guess, like being liberal enough or like secretly communicating racism in their work. Meanwhile, conservatives are just like dominating fucking elections across the country and shit like that. And like this is, this bizarro collectivism is like the form of activism that some of these people take. So that was one of the more ridiculous examples, to be honest. But there was other ones like a big one is like bad characters in books. So like if you have a character who like let's say has some racist views, some misogynistic books, those books are like, especially if you're not already in the system, if you're not already like, Stephen King or whoever, to like do that type of book as a first time author, like you're going to be up against some fucking obstacles. Like people I interviewed, like I remember this agent who's fucking awesome, represents sort of like a who's who of contemporary authors. She's been in the game for a while. And she was like telling me, she's like, I'll be in meetings now. And like someone will be like, we gotta edit this book. Like this misogynistic dude appears on page 86 and just like trashes women, and like nobody calls him out for his sexism. And she's like telling me, she's like, dude, the book is set in like 1870. Like there's misogynists, like they existed, like they exist today. But there's this idea that if you are to include them, which itself is you're already overcoming a barrier, because the publishers themselves know how dumb people are on social media. So like they'll tell me, they'll be like, even though this book is super progressive, it has, a misogynistic character in the draft, and we got to remove the character because we're worried that someone will just screenshot that bit of dialogue, put it on Twitter, and then the book itself gets, criticized for being sexist or whatever. So basically, like, if you somehow manage to include like a super racist character, like sexist character, they have to like get their comeuppance in the story. Clearly you can tell I'm not very sympathetic to these books. I think they're like moralistic trash in my opinion. But
no, and it also sounds as you're talking that like social media plays a significant role in all of this,
100%.
because it gives a lot more power to maybe what is a fringe, right? Because if you went and complained about the book because you're like, oh, there's this racist character in the book, like, okay, you told a couple of your friends, but now things go viral because take a screenshot, whatever, outrage goes viral. That's a big problem now for a publisher. So it seems like that's a big factor.
Yeah, all the publishers are aware of this shit. They're also aware of like, there's book communities within the social media platforms. So things like Bookstagram, Book Talk, they're aware of who like big influences are and stuff like that. Like they're all fully conscious of it because there's a huge bottom line aspect to it. But like they'll literally be like, yo, like we need to get this misogynistic character out of the book because like this is an otherwise good book. And like I don't want to see attention get drawn to this and like mischaracterize the book. So even people who are like, this is so self-evidently ridiculous, like this is a fictional character, they're still like from a pragmatic standpoint, like we want the book to do well and like we don't want to run the risk of a controversy.
So like American Psycho,
Fucking
that would be a no-go. Me too.
I heard they're remaking it like a movie, and I'm like, who approved this? Like A24 or something, or are they going to water it down? Yeah,
wow.
it's
Well, that book had a big impact on me, by the way. I was completely
okay.
scarred by it.
Okay.
I was a very innocent young girl, and was recommended to me by a librarian. And he's like, "It's it's a satire set in New York. You like New York, kind of yuppie culture. You're kind of yuppie."
That's such a benign way of describing that.
Such a benign way. I had no idea what was coming, and meanwhile, not into violence, not into, very innocent. And God, dear God, that book. But it's so brilliant too. It's so brilliant in so many ways, including I got to ask the author recently because I was on his podcast, and
I have an American Psycho sweatshirt, so like
he's great. So I'm a big fan too, I think. But one thing that the book did to me is that, because you know how it repeats a lot, it repeats and repeats the character's narration. And what happens is that your head, you start thinking of the world like that. You also start having that inner monologue like he does about things. Or at least that was my experience. And I was like, this has to be intentional. So I had asked him, and I was vindicated all these years later, because that was indeed intentional, and really, really brilliant. But yeah, like that book in this climate, I don't know, probably wouldn't work, because he's certainly a misogynist, and to say the very least. It's I kind of have to wonder, like, do you know, how does somebody become even a sensitivity reader?
Yeah. Before I answer that question, I'm just going to offer my 2 cents about American Psycho. I fucking love that book. I love the movie. There's probably 2 things that I could quote the most of, more than like 99% of the population. Quotes from American Psycho. I could just feed me stray cat, all that shit. And Conor McGregor quotes. I'm a huge UFC fan, independent of all the stuff. But that book, the difference between today and then, so that is like, I understand why people would not want to read that book. It's a 400-page book with like really graphic descriptions of violence interspersed with like really boring scenes where this guy's just like talking about what people wear and stuff. Like, I get it if you don't want to read that. I taught that book in 1 semester of an English course. I would never teach it again, because I immediately realized, I was like, my tastes are not remotely reflective of normal people. But the difference between now and then is like, that was Bret Easton Ellis's second book, and that book was dropped by the publisher because it was accused of homophobia, misogyny. I mean, Bret's gay, so take that for what it's worth. But it was a conflation of like the character with the author, that sort of thing. Especially because like at the end of the book, like Patrick Bateman doesn't get his comeuppance; he just like continues on. But the difference between now and then is like his book immediately got picked up by, I think it was Penguin Random House, so like another big publisher, and then it was published and it did well and made into a hit movie. And but that you would not, first off, that would never make it to like the upper level today, not absolutely. And then if it was canceled, like the other publishers would not touch that with a 10-foot pole. That's the difference. So like your question about sensitivity readers, how does one become one? This is a big problem that I talk about sort of at length in my book. And I think it relates to a broader problem of like expertise in our culture right now. Like, what counts as expertise? How do we define experts? if one is considered an expert, how do they sort of like lose their expert credentials, even if those are sort of informal and cultural? So essentially, a sensitivity reader is someone who says they're a sensitivity reader. More specifically, a sensitivity reader is someone who shares quote unquote marginalized identity with a fictional character. So if I'm a black dude, I could be a sensitivity reader for like black men. If I'm a gay woman, I could be a sensitivity reader for like gay female characters. The shit gets like really granular. So if you go on like X, you'll see two kinds of posts. You'll see posts from people who identify as sensitivity readers. So they'll be like, I'm a half black, whatever, intellectually disabled person who lost a leg. I can be a sensitivity reader. I'm being a bit flippant, but like it does get like quite granular. And then the other kind of post is just publishers or authors or agents looking to hire a sensitivity reader. So they'll be like, hey, I'm working on a 60,000 word manuscript. It has a gay side character. I'm not gay. I need a gay sensitivity reader. So then these people are brought on. Some of them actually make quite a lot of money if they're in the sort of top tier. And basically they just read the book and they tell you if like it's offensive. More specifically, they'll use language like, is this authentic to like the quote unquote gay community, the trans community. And, to give this the most generous reading possible, I think a lot of this is coming from a good place. For years, you have had white authors writing black characters, straight authors writing gay characters. And like in a not insignificant amount of books, they like really reduce people to like crude stereotypes and shit like that. So like, I get that, but obviously it should raise immediate problems that like, one gay dude on Twitter is like purporting to like understand the experience of like a really diverse constituency of people. Like I've talked to editors who are literally like, like what my publisher like hired like an Indian woman to like
Like
read.
one person.
Yeah, they're
Yeah,
just like,
and
who the fuck
it's
is
also like I feel like it's also like kind of on the writer to get those things right. Like if you get it wrong, you're probably not the greatest writer, but also you can go and talk to people that you think would reflect um, who you kind of trust and whose taste you trust and background you trust. Um, I mean, I also one of the people I interviewed for my book, John Patrick Shanley. He, obviously an amazing writer, playwright, Pulitzer winner, but he talks about how one of the plays he wrote was like he got picked up by black theater because they thought he was black because he was he lived in an area, right? I think he grew up in Harlem or something like that, and he just has a good ear and it was listening, so he has a lot of characters that reflect the diverse background of where he lived, and they're well written and accurate, and so enough that his play got picked up, and then they were like, when he showed up, I think they were like really surprised. Oh, you're surprised, you're white and Italian. But it's like some people, when you're a good writer, you're able to do that. And maybe if you feel like maybe you're not as good at capturing certain backgrounds, that maybe you go to somebody or a few people and you show them, and he's like, hey, is this accurate to how people in your community talk? But it's different, I feel like, if it's the writer themselves and they still have that final say versus like a sensitivity reader that some publisher had hired
Yeah.
this one person, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the sensitivity readers are, I think, in large part being brought in as a kind of disaster insurance because publishers are in a double bind. And by publishers, I also mean like literary agents who have to sell a manuscript to a publisher.
Mm,
And the double bind is this: if I'm a white dude and I write a novel and it's only white people, like that's not going to fucking pass because there's this obsession with diverse characters and diverse books. So they're just going to be like, fuck this. And if it gets published, that is going to be pointed out by Kirkus or Publishers Weekly or whoever. So that's a problem. So they're like, okay, if you're a white guy writing a novel, you need people of color, maybe need some trans people, whatever. But like, you're going to get fucking trashed for doing that. And like,
yeah.
between us, you're going to get trashed even if you do it right. Like by certain people, that's just how that is. So they're like, okay, if we bring in Mark, who's gay, to like It sounds so ridiculous to me.
To gay proof
Like,
the book.
like read this book
With
set
the
in
gay
like
stamp of approval.
1950. Yeah, and it's like, well, I know gay conservatives, I know gay progressives, I know gay black people, I know gay white people, I know like what like the irony is that like white people are not treated in the sort of same homogenizing way.
Mm.
Like people in publishing would accept that like me, a white dude who like went to Cornell, like might not think exactly the same as like my dad, a military veteran who didn't go to college. Like there's an understanding of nuance, but like with this stuff, it's literally like I'm not even shitting you. It's even
That's true.
funny.
There's no white guy proofreading a book by a black
No,
author
no,
writing white characters, so or Italian characters,
no.
which is it is quite silly. I mean, again, I think I appreciate because me like okay, so I haven't grown up in Harlem. I would probably be like kind of afraid to write a black character specifically. Like I might just write them like any other character, but I probably
Right.
wouldn't write. Um, and we often can write more what we know, but it does create also this like real culture of fear versus like instead of culture of curiosity, where I think like I mean, I think it's nice to see more people reflected in culture where it's like different backgrounds instead of just one background. But and so they are, I think, able to capture some of these stories better, perhaps. But again, some people just have an ear for it. They understand different communities, and curiosity is a good way to learn about these groups. And so instead of just kind of, well, you must write it this way, right? It just takes the creativity out. I also thought of another book that I think would definitely not be published, and that would be Charles Bukowski's Post Office. I don't
Everything.
know if you've
Yeah,
like that book is just
yeah. You say everything he's written, but
No, yeah, probably everything he's written. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, probably not a great guy, from what I understand, he's not a great guy. His
yeah,
characters are awful, and he definitely doesn't get their, does some horrible things. I mean, that book is like my jaw is it drops at sometimes at some of the things that go on, but at the same time, it's still a really good literary work, and it captures something. It's very uncomfortable, but okay, art is meant to be uncomfortable. You don't have to like the characters. The characters don't have the bad guys don't always lose in real life either. In fact, they often win. And I think that's important to portray too. So yeah. I'm curious,
yeah,
like what do you think is the role of, you have the publishers, but um libraries and librarians are supposed to be pretty committed to speech and expression, freedom of expression. I don't know if this had come up in your research at all, but what is kind of the attitude in the library world?
yeah. So I did interview a few people who are like directors of public library systems. I would say the library profession, as you might guess, is heavily left of center in the same way like academia is, and like to get an MLS, like a Master of Library Science, like you're in academic culture and stuff. So like that's not surprising to me. I would say like there is a very clear constituency of librarians who are like very committed to intellectual freedom. So like the American Library Association, they have their Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy. Like there's people who are like, our role as librarians is to not be like the arbiters of what should be on our, like not to be the arbiters of like what is and is not allowed to be read, but to like give our patrons the books they want. So like if our patrons want to read Ann Coulter's book, like we're going to put Ann Coulter's book on the shelf. Now, again, like to your point that you've made more than once throughout this podcast, like people don't have infinite resources. Like you have to determine what books should not be on the shelves. Like you can't include everything. But there are like legit librarians who are like, if the public wants it, we have to give it to them, whether it's Steve Bannon or whoever. Now that said, there are many other librarians who do not have that attitude. I remember talking to one librarian in particular who was like, I have colleagues in my system who will not shelve Christian fiction, even if our constituents, our patrons want it. Like they just think it's
Hmm.
trash. I've heard of other people who like, I mean, this is probably less surprising, who like would not put like a book by, just name your person, Alex Jones and Coulter on the shelf, even though like some of those books are New York Times bestsellers. Like they're gonna do
Right.
well. And these are librarians who see themselves as kind of more like social justicey, like we're not just gonna be uncritical, like we're gonna not quote unquote like platform these authors. I think that's totally the wrong move for like any number of reasons, but first and foremost, from a totally pragmatic perspective, public libraries are publicly funded. So if you want librarians or libraries to go the direction of the universities, which is like mass disdain for them on the right, because especially the top ones have just basically turned into like left-wing think tanks, then sure, like don't put Ann Coulter on your shelf. Like that sounds like a great path to like diminish the bipartisan public support that you need to like actually get funding. So like I firmly think it's in their pragmatic interest to stock the sort of broad kinds of books that like people overall are going to want. But there's librarians who are not on board with that.
It's quite fascinating to me, like, how they decide, because I know some libraries do respond to requests. Like, even with my book, like, I know it's in a bunch of libraries, and some of them I know, like, people might have requested, but, there's a lot where, no, that's not the case, and uh I am curious on what basis, right? Like, if it's someone really famous, like, I can
Yeah,
kinda understand it's just high demand anyways. But if it's, like, that was my first book, yeah, I'm kinda curious about that process. But I also feel, like you do, like, libraries they are meant to represent all people because they're public, and not the tastes and whims of particular librarians. So they do need like some system that I think is like fair and not biased. Um, and they do stock, I think, some libraries Mindkind, which I think people should be able to access. Just don't, I wouldn't promote it and make money off of it, but certainly
mm-hmm.
people, like, I think it's important for people to read those kinds of works too, because it's a primary record of
Sure.
somebody who was responsible for a lot of very atrocious things in history, thought and put out there, and was supported despite that. Um, so your book comes out on August 12th.
Yeah.
Where can people find it, and where can people find you?
I am harder to find the book. The book itself, I mean, you can buy the book anywhere: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, Walmart, Penguin Random House's website. I technically have a Twitter I've never posted on. I kind of just use it to look at other people's Twitters, but I have a website. Like if you actually want to get in contact with me personally, just reach out. But
Okay, I'll put it in the description so people can check
sure.
out.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations on your new book, and thanks so
Cool.
much
Thank
for
you.
joining me.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
Catherine. Appreciate it.